Hello all. Today we are going to start the second unit and which starts with theories of international trade. What is international trade? We have learned it well in the previous unit, but international trade theories are simply different theories to explain international trade. Now, trade is the concept of exchanging goods and services between two people or entities, whereas international trade is the concept of exchange between people or entities in two different countries. That is what we have learned previously. People or entities trade because they believe that they benefit from the exchange, right? Or trade only happens when there is a mutual benefit. Now, there may be a need, want, or desire for goods or services. Um, at the surface, it may sound like very simple, but there is a lot of theory, policies, business strategies are involved that actually compose or constitute the international trade. Now, in this presentation, we are going to learn about the different trade theories, the theories which actually tell you why trade happens, how trade happens, what is the modus operandi, and the different trade theories that have actually evolved over the past century and the theories which are relevant today. Also, you'll be able to explore the factors that impact international trade and how businesses and governments use these factors to benefit or promote their interests or their country's interest. What are the different international trade theories? So, around 5,000 years ago, Uruk in southern Mesopotamia was probably the first city in the world that had ever seen housing more than 50,000 people within its 6 miles of walls. Uruk's agriculture, made prosperous by sophisticated irrigation canals, was home to the first class of middlemen, trade intermediaries, a cooperative trade network that set the pattern that would endure for the next 6,000 years. So this is the trade which we are doing is actually originated in Mesopotamia. In more recent centuries, economists have focused on trying to understand and explain these trade patterns. Thomas Friedman's flat world approach segments history in three stages: globalization from 1492 to 1800s, then the second one from 1800 to 2000, and the third one from 2000 to the present. In globalization, nations dominated global expansion. In globalization 2, the multinational companies ascended and pushed global development. Today, in the third one, the technology drives globalization. Now, to better understand how global trade has evolved, it's important to understand how countries traded with one another in history. Over time, economists have developed theories to explain the mechanisms of global trade. The main historical theories are called classical and are from the perspective of a country or country based. By the mid 20th century, the theories began to shift to explain trade from a firm rather than a country perspective. Now, these theories are referred to as modern and are firm based or company based. Both of these categories, classical and modern, consist of several international theories. So, the first are classical, or they have a perspective of a country, or they are known as country based. Whereas the modern theories of international trade are company based or firm based theories. Under the classical or country based theories, we have mercantilism, absolute advantage theory, comparative advantage theory, and Heckscher-Ohlin theory. After Heckscher-Ohlin, there is Leontief paradox, which we would be doing, which is an extension of Heckscher-Ohlin theory only. Now, in modern firm-based or company-based theories, we'd be doing country similarity theory, product life cycle theory, global strategic rivalry theory, and Porter's national competitive advantage theory. So, all these we'll be doing under the theories of international trade. Now, let's start with mercantilism, that is a country based theory. Under classical or country-based trade theories, mercantilism is the first one. Developed in 16th century, mercantilism was one of the earliest efforts to develop an economic theory. Now, this theory stated that a country's wealth was determined by the amount of its gold and silver holdings. In its simplest sense, mercantilists believed that a country should increase its holding of gold and silver by promoting exports and discouraging imports. In other words, if people in other countries buy more from you, that means you export more, then they sell to you, that means you are importing. Then they have to pay you the difference in gold and silver. The objective of each country was to have a trade surplus or a situation where the value of exports are greater than the value of imports, and to avoid a trade deficit or a situation where the value of imports is greater than the value of exports, and hence what are you doing? You are preserving your gold and silver holdings. So you do not need to pay the trade deficit through gold and silver, and hence you will avoid trade deficit at every cost. A closer look at world's history from 1500s to the late 1800s helps explain why mercantilism flourished. The 1500s marked the rise of new nation states whose rulers wanted to strengthen their nations by building larger armies and national institutions. By increasing exports and trade, these rulers were able to amass more gold and wealth for their countries. One way that many of these new nations promoted exports was to impose restrictions on imports. Now, this strategy is called protectionism and is still used today as we know it. So, to protect your own country's trade, you put tariff or non tariff barriers or impose restrictions on imports. Now, nations expanded their wealth by using their colonies around the world in an effort to control more trade and amass more riches. The British colonial empire was one of the more successful examples. It sought to increase its wealth by using raw materials from places ranging from what are now the Americas and India. France and Netherlands, Portugal, and Spain were also successful in building large colonial empires that generated extensive wealth for their governing nations. Although mercantilism is one of the oldest trade theories, it remains part of modern thinking. Countries such as Japan, China, Singapore, Taiwan, and even Germany still favor exports and discourage imports through a form of neo mercantilism, in which the countries promote a combination of protectionist policies and restrictions and domestic industry subsidies. Nearly every country at one point or the other has implemented some form of protectionist policy to guard the key industries in its economy as well as protecting its domestic trade. Now, while export oriented companies usually support protectionist policies that favor their industries or firms, other companies and consumers are hurt by protectionism. Taxpayers pay for government subsidies of select exports in the form of higher taxes. Import restrictions lead to higher prices for consumers who pay more for foreign made goods or services. Free trade advocates highlight how free trade benefits all members of the global community, while mercantilism's protectionist policies only benefit select industries at the expense of both consumers and other companies within and outside of the industry. Now, with mercantilism, it was a very, very conservative theory of restricting your imports and expanding your exports so as to save the gold holdings or silver holdings in your country. And protectionism is encouraged, which becomes a negative of mercantilism. Now, in 1776, Adam Smith questioned this leading mercantile theory of the time in The Wealth of Nations. Adam Smith, in an inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth of nations, his recent versions have been edited by scholars and economists as well. But what did it say? Smith offered a new trade theory, and that is known as absolute advantage, which focused on the ability of a country to produce a good more efficiently than the other nation. Actually, Smith reasoned that trade between countries shouldn't be regulated or restricted by government policy or intervention. He stated that trade should flow naturally according to market forces. In a hypothetical two-country world, if country A could produce a good cheaper or faster or both than country B, then country A had the advantage and could focus on specializing on producing that good. Now, similarly, if country B was better at producing another good, it could well focus on specialization as well. Now, by specialization, countries would generate efficiencies because their labor force would become more skilled by doing the same task. Production would also become more efficient because there would be an incentive to create faster and better production methods to increase the specialization. Now, Smith's theory reasoned that with increased efficiencies, people in both countries would benefit and trade should be encouraged. His theory stated that a nation's wealth shouldn't be judged by how much gold and silver it had, but rather by the living standards of the people. What were the assumptions of the absolute advantage theory? It is that trade is between two countries only. There are only two commodities traded. Free trade exists between the countries, and the only element of cost of production is labor. What are the implications or significance of absolute advantage theory? So, more quantity of both products would be produced because if both the countries have some advantage, then they would be able to produce more. There would be increased standard of living in both the countries because they are doing the best they can do. Then there is increased production efficiency, increase in global efficiency and effectiveness, and maximization of global productivity and other resource productivity. Now, but then what has been the criticism? So there can be certain countries which do not have any absolute advantage. Then how would trade happen? The country size varies. There is a very small country and there are very, very large countries. Country by country differences in specialization. So the specialization is also very different. And it deals with labor only and neglects other factors. There are various other resources which are required, like capital, right? Then neglected transport costs. Transport costs plays a very significant role in the international trade, which has been neglected in this absolute advantage theory. Now we come to with the problems of absolute advantage theory because it fails to explain how does trade happens if there is no absolute advantage with any country. So comes the comparative advantage. Now, the challenge of absolute advantage theory was that some countries may be better at producing both goods and therefore have an advantage in many areas. Now, in contrast, another country may not have any useful absolute advantages. How do we really answer this? Now, to answer this, David Ricardo, an English economist, introduced the theory of comparative advantage in 1817. Ricardo reasoned that even if country A had the absolute advantage in the production of both products, specialization and trade could still occur between two countries. Comparative advantage occurs when a country cannot produce a product more efficiently than the other country. However, it can produce that product better and more efficiently than it does other goods. The difference between these two theories is subtle. Comparative advantage focuses on the relative productivity differences, whereas absolute advantage looks at the absolute productivity. Let's take a simplified hypothetical example to illustrate the subtle difference between these principles. Now, Miranda is a Wall Street lawyer who charges $500 per hour for her legal services. It turns out that Miranda can also type faster than the administrative assistants in her office who are paid $40 per hour. Now, even though Miranda clearly has the absolute advantage in both the skill sets, but should she be doing both the jobs? No. For every hour Miranda decides to type instead of doing legal work, she would be giving up $460 in her income, right? Her productivity and income will be highest if she specializes in the high paid legal services and hires the most qualified administrative assistant who can type fast, although a little slower than Miranda. By having both Miranda and her assistant concentrate on their respective tasks, their overall productivity as a team would be higher. Now, this is comparative advantage. A person or a country will specialize in doing what they do relatively better. In reality, the world economy is much more complex and consists of more than two countries and products. Barriers to trade may exist, and goods must be transported, stored, and distributed. However, this simplistic example demonstrates the basis of comparative advantage theory. Now, we can take example of two countries like US and India. And let us say the US has an absolute advantage over making computers as well as making textiles. Making computers fetches them a net profit of $200, and making a textile has an absolute advantage of, let us say, $20. So the US would let India make or manufacture the textiles and would concentrate on the computer and technology part, because in this way the entire world economy, considering that these are the two countries in the world economy, the productivity would be the highest. So that is what is comparative advantage. What are the assumptions of comparative advantage? They say that there are only two nations and two commodities. There is free trade. There are no barriers to trade. There are no regulations on trade between the two countries. Now, labor theory of value. Labor is the only factor of production. In other words, the cost of production of the commodities is measured by the labor time involved in producing them. Then absence of transportation costs. Labor is perfectly mobile within a country, but it is perfectly immobile between countries. So within the country, they can move anywhere, but they would not go outside the countries. The implication of the assumption is that the wage rate within a country is same throughout because of the perfect mobility of labor, but as between nations, wages may differ because one country cannot migrate to one country, one labor from one country cannot migrate to another country. Now, constant costs of production. There are constant returns to scale in production. The cost conditions remain same irrespective of the level of production. Then there is full employment of labor. To produce more of one commodity, labor will have to be diverted from one commodity to the other, and the total labor remains constant. And then technology remains unchanged. All these assumptions are actually the limitations of comparative cost advantage theory. Criticisms of Ricardo's law of comparative advantage. Labor theory of value. The most severe criticism of Ricardo's theory was his assumption of labor theory of value. Under this assumption, the price of commodity depends exclusively on the amount of labor used in its production. Now, this implication has some certain assumptions that labor is the only factor of production, which is not so. There can be other factors. Then labor is used in same fixed proportion in the production of all the commodities, which cannot be true. Labor hours for computers may be 150 hours, and for textile per unit it may be just 1 hour. So the proportion may vary in terms of labor. And then labor is homogeneous. That means there is no distinction between skilled, semi-skilled, or unskilled workers. In reality, that is not so. We can distinguish the labor by its skills. Now, none of these implications is true. Like I've told you, labor is not the only factor of production. The commodities require a number of factors of production, such as land, labor, capital. Then labor is not used in the same fixed proportions. The production of textiles require much more labor than the production of cars. Cars require more capital per unit required in than what is required in the production of textiles. Then labor is not homogeneous. It varies in productivity, skill, training, and consequently in wages. So there is not one class of labor with a single wage, but a number of non-competing groups between which the wages are not equalized. Hence, there has been a lot many limitations for comparative cost advantage theory as well. And then we move to Heckscher-Ohlin theory, that is also known as factor proportions theory. The theories of Smith and Ricardo didn't help countries determine which products would give a country an advantage. Now, both theories assumed that free and open market would lead countries and producers to determine which goods they could produce more efficiently. In the early 1900s, two Swedish economists, Ali Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin, focused their attention on how a country could gain comparative advantage by producing products that utilize factors that were in abundance in the country. Their theory is based on a country's production factors like land, labor, and capital, which provides the funds for investment in plants and equipment. They determined that the cost of any factor or resource was a function of supply and demand. Factors that were in the great supply relative to demand would be cheaper. Factors in great demand relative to supply would be more expensive. Their theory, that is also known as factor proportions theory, stated that countries would produce and export goods that required resources or factors that were in the great supply and therefore cheaper production factors. Now, in contrast, countries would import goods that require resources that were in the short supply but higher demand. Now, for example, China and India are home to cheap, large pools of labor. Hence, these countries have become the optimal locations for labor-intensive industries like textiles and garments. Now, whereas in USA and European countries, they have a lot of capital. So, there are capital-intensive industries that are flourishing. Now, according to Ohlin, the underlying forces behind differences in comparative costs are twofold. The different regions or countries have different factor endowments, and the different goods require different factor proportions for their production. Now, it is well known fact that various countries are differently endowed with production factors required for production of goods. Some countries possess relatively more capital, some relatively more labor, some may have more land. Japan doesn't have land, but US has ample land, right? So the factor which is relatively abundant in a country will tend to have a lower price, and the factor which is relatively scarce will tend to have a higher price. Now, this, according to Olin, factor endowments and factor prices are intimately associated with each other. Now, suppose K stands for the availability or supply of capital, L for labor, and PK for price of capital, PL for the price of labor. Also, we'll take two countries A and B. Country A's capital is relatively abundant and labor is relatively scarce, and the reverse is the case of country B, where capital is scarce and labor is abundant. Given these factor endowments, in country A, capital would be relatively cheaper. Since K upon L, that is capital over labor, is greater than capital over labor in B country, and price of capital is lesser in than the price of capital in the B country. So these differences in factor endowments cause differences in factor prices, and therefore accordingly they account for differences in comparative costs of producing different commodities. Together with the difference in factor endowments, differences in factor proportions required for the production of different commodities also constitute an important force underlying differences in comparative costs as between different countries. Now, some commodities are such that their production requires relatively more capital than other factors. So they are called capital intensive commodities. Now, still other commodities require relatively more land than capital and labor and are therefore called land intensive commodities. If we evaluate Heckscher-Ohlin theory, we see that it has made invaluable contribution to the explanation of international trade. Though this theory accepts comparative costs as the basis of international trade, it makes several improvements in the classical comparative cost theory. Firstly, it rescued the theory of international trade from the grip of labor theory of value and based it on general equilibrium theory of value, according to which both demand and supply conditions determine the price of goods and factors. Second, Heckscher-Ohlin theory removes the differences between international trade and inter-regional trade, for the factors determining the two are the same. Third, a significant improvement is the explanation offered for differences in comparative costs of commodities between trading countries. And fourth, as pointed out by Professor Lancaster, Heckscher-Ohlin model provides a satisfactory picture of the future of foreign trade. According to the Ricardian theory, international trade exists because of differences in skill and efficiency of the labor alone. Now, what has been the shortcomings or limitations of Heckscher-Ohlin theory? In Heckscher-Ohlin theory, it has been assumed that relative factor prices reflect the relative supplies of factors. That is, a factor which is found in abundance in a country will have a lower price and vice versa. This means that in the determination of factor prices, supply outweighs demand. But if demand for factors prevails over supply, then factor prices so determined would not conform to the supply of factors. Thus, if in a country there is abundance of capital and scarcity of labor in physical terms, but there is relatively much greater demand for capital, then the price of capital would be relatively higher to that of the labor. Then, under these circumstances, contrary to its factor endowments, the country many export labor intensive goods and import capital intensive goods. Perhaps it is this which lies behind the empirical findings by Leontief that though America is a capital abundant and labor scarce country, in the structure of its imports, capital intensive goods are relatively greater, whereas in the structure of its export, labor intensive goods are relatively greater. As this is contrary to the popularly held view, this is known as Leontief paradox. Against Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, it has also been pointed out that differences in tastes and preferences for goods are to be put in other words. Differences in pattern of demand also gives rise to trade between the countries. This is because under differences in demand or preferences for goods, the commodity price ratios would not conform to the cost ratios based on the factor endowments. If we want to take an example on this, we can say that there are two countries A and B that have similar factor endowments. Now, according to Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, with same factor endowments, cost ratio of producing the two commodities and hence the commodity price ratio should be the same. Hence, there is no possibility of trade between the two countries on the basis of Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. But what happens? Trade between the two countries is possible if the demand pattern or preferences of the people of two countries, let's say for wheat and rice, greatly differ. So someone appreciates rice more, another one appreciates wheat more, and you have to see that people have different tastes and preferences, and hence they would trade between wheat and rice. These have been the references for this current presentation. Thank you so much for listening.